for your 7-minute introduction to the topic in front of us. Geraldine.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Khalil. You actually made it quite easy for us because you spoke about the four, if I can call it that, the four issues that are quite responsible for a number of the challenges, the key disruptive forces as that affects development or more sustainable, inclusive economies. And this is especially for marginalized populations. So you spoke about the climate crisis. You spoke about the fourth industrial revolution. You spoke about the alarming growth of inequality. And you spoke about what some refer to as the black swan event, COVID-19. What I'd like to add to that is, of course, the absence of trust that's been there in leadership in particular. So it makes it even more complex as we look at the need to build sustainable, inclusive economies. And the next point that I'd also raise is the fact that we're in an environment where truth, facts, and science had almost become obsolete to some and some leaders, because I would presume that the discussion we're having this evening for me, this morning, your end, is what could inform the direction that should be taken. So as we deal with this, I'm going to raise one or two issues first before I go further into the discussion. And I want to put the point on the table that even before COVID-19, we have seen an economic downturn, a recession, as some would call in some parts of the world, a depression in others. However, there was also a sense, and this was reflected on at the beginning of last year, that seems like a decade ago, where there was an acknowledgement that there may be a shifting of the center of economic gravity to the east and south. We need to reflect on that now and look at it again. And this was due to the fact that among emerging economies, there are and were 18 high growth outperformers. And these include countries such as China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, India, Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea, and Thailand. And we've seen through the economic performance, powerful and sustained long-term growth. And in particular, when we looked at China, we looked at that region, we saw that more than 1 billion people were lifted out of extreme poverty since 1990. Now, my understanding from this discussion is that we are looking at what can be done that will be considered quite audacious. And I think with COVID, we need to be more so. We need more audacity, if I can put it that way. And I'm not sure if I will be able to give answers to that, because, I mean, this is also coinciding with a period where labor productivity growth was at historic lows. So you then put this black swan event on top of it. And I think for some countries, it's knocked it sort of out of a ballpark, really. But I'm going to leave it to the economists on the panel to do an in-depth analysis on that. So I want to go to a few examples on what is to be done. And one of the issues that I do want to place on the table that's come through the discourse in recent times is the importance of the state and the public sector. Because we've seen for 4 decades an approach, a more neoliberal approach that has actually nullified or tried to nullify the role of the state and the role of the public sector, and tried to suggest that the private sector would be the panacea to everything. Interestingly, earlier this year, we've seen The Guardian, we've even seen Time magazine and others talk more and more about the importance of the role of the public sector and how in economic growth, for economic growth as well, you need public-private partnerships. And this is absolutely critical. So let me link this to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. And I should state up front that I am the chair of the Committee on Experts for Public Administration, a subsidiary body of ECOSOC and the United Nations. And our focus is largely on SDG 16. And SDG 16 looks at institutions and enduring institutions. And I think very clearly, out of what we've seen over recent times, and whether we want to confront the climate crisis, and as we should be dealing with inequalities in society or the fourth industrial revolution, if you don't have enduring and resilient institutions, you have a challenge. So again, what will be audacious is reviewing the way in which the state has been viewed and ensuring that public servants and the public service does not get itself pushed back to a situation of the past 4 decades that said less government. And also the way in which government should be perceived is not a traditional one or a narrow Weberian one, but one that is also able to adapt and respond with resilience and flexibility to the realities that are being confronted. One that will ensure that no one is left behind, because I think this is what it's all about, and that's what's fundamental. So as I conclude on this, and I'd like to come back again, and I'm sure I'll have opportunity, I want to give one concrete example that goes beyond government and more to a development finance institution.
About 1 more minute, Gerald. We have about 1 more minute.
Was mentioned earlier. And that's looking at different kinds of models that will be more inclusive. And I'll talk to it again, but that one such model was an affirmative finance action for women in Africa proposal that brought together the whole issue of access to finance, along with technical assistance and policy dialogue. But it was to bring the marginalized into the mainstream. And I'll pause on that. Thank you.
Geraldine, thank you for setting the scene so brilliantly for us, and for immediately taking our gaze to the importance of enduring resilient institutions, especially in the public sector, and the public sector's role in underwriting a dynamic and inclusive economy. Geraldine, let me ask you about one particular kind of institution, just as a rapid follow-up to your comments so far. You're sitting at Nelson Mandela University. You're part of the leadership there. Can you say a word about the particular role of the university in the developing world on the economic development side? Do you have a view as to what might be a priority orientation for universities today in the developing world if they're really going to be an agent for this inclusive and sustainable economic development?
I think universities, higher education institutions are amongst the most important, because after all, they're responsible for developing human capital and ensuring that there's the required skills base in a changing and complex world. And if you look at Africa, we have what we can either call the youth dividend, or the youth bulge that could be negative. And to a large degree, we face the complexity with talk of a fourth industrial revolution, with the importance of AI, the use of technology to overcome divides. And yet we have a disjuncture that we also have youth that don't have the requisite skill sets in order to catapult the continent into a future that will reflect Africa for what it should be, a reservoir, a continent that has assets, both in terms of human capacity, but as well as natural resources. And we need to ensure that that's there. And that's where universities come in and should play a role. And also with a very strong multidisciplinary focus so that we are able to engage in complex realities.
Geraldine, thank you for kicking us off. Strong and enduring institutions, a vibrant, nimble, flexible public sector, human capital investments, interdisciplinary study, all of these things, and research, really very, very important parts of the equation. I'm going to turn us now to Lisa Sachs. Lisa, I'm going to bring you in here. Lisa is the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University in New York. Lisa, welcome. Why don't we hand it over to you now to tackle this question from where you sit.
Thank you so much. What remarks to follow, because I think Geraldine hit on so many of the key issues. So I'm really grateful to have heard that, to learn from it, but also to be participating. I'll try to complement all of Geraldine's remarks, all of which I agree with and I think are certainly relevant. Let me start with the answer to one of the questions, Khalil, that had been posed to us, which is, what is a framework for bridging public-private investment? And I have to start with the framework that I wake up in the morning thinking about and go to sleep thinking about, and that is, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the 17 goals that the world's governments agreed to in 2015 to make economies that are socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. It's a pretty good idea. The 17 goals give us a framework for inclusive economic development that conserves and respects our planetary boundaries and societal well-being. But achieving sustainable development has been really challenging. Our global economy and our national economies produce, as you said, Khalil, huge and worsening inequalities and environmental crises. In terms of environmental crises, I would add to the major one that you emphasized on climate change, which of course is critically urgent. It's getting worse and we're not facing it. We also are facing environmental crises of land use. We're facing catastrophic declines of biodiversity, of species abundance, or decline in species abundance. We're facing a crisis of mega pollution in our oceans, our air, our water, all different types of pollutants, plastics, toxic chemicals, and so on. And the other environmental crisis that we're facing is pandemic diseases, which we know are secondary to land use changes and to climate change. COVID has, of course, been particularly horrible, hard to control, easy to transmit with high death rates, but it joins a long and growing list of other recent pandemics, SARS, Zika, swine flu, and others. So these environmental crises are, first of all, pervasive, but they reflect the basic point that the massive scale, the massive and growing scale of global economic activity on a finite Earth, we are reaching our limits. We have basically commandeered the Earth's ecosystems to devastating extent. And at the same time, as you noted, we're facing a massive social crisis of huge inequalities, and unequal societies don't work well. There's unrest, there's violence, and there's unmet economic potential. There's also the fact that pandemic diseases are harder to control. But this inequality is widening, not narrowing. Now, mainly because technological advances are favoring the educated and favoring those with capital and have been disadvantageous to lower skilled workers. I find it utterly shocking that during this pandemic, it's been oft repeated that about 500 billionaires saw their wealth increase by nearly $1 trillion during the last few months, while working families lost their jobs. There's a massive food insecurity crisis. Families are losing their homes, healthcare, et cetera. So the inequality is really a widespread phenomenon, and we are not designed well politically to face it. These are all basic identifiable problems, and my appreciation of the Sustainable Development Goals is that it is a framework, and the Paris Climate Agreement and many other international agreements like this give us a framework to address these, and they can and should serve as our framework to address these. And that is true with respect to investment as well. So to my mind, the question is how we restore and align economic activity without restoring the old patterns of environmental degradation and widening inequality. I agree completely with Geraldine about the critical role of public investment or of governments, not only both in terms of public investment, also in terms of their regulatory function as well. But just to wrap up my remarks, I would offer a complementary perspective just for the sake of discussion, which I think that this also means really critically evaluating private investment and the financial sector, and to examine the ways in which financial flows are exacerbating the crises that we're facing. I think the emphasis has too much been put on the role for impact investing. Of course, there's some role for investment in new technologies. For instance, for a net zero energy system, there is a useful role for scaling up private finance. There's some role for blended finance. I agree with that. But I think that there's also a critical need to ensure that the rest of investment, the other 99% of capital flows, is not undermining the SDGs. We are not yet having a serious discussion about that. We don't have an agreement on the expectations either of the business sector or the financial sector with respect to the harm that they're causing and how their role in exacerbating both inequalities and environmental crises. So overwhelmingly, there's misalignment, I would say, between private investment and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I will add that to the discussion, that my concrete proposal is that we advance a framework for industry and for the financial sector to understand and to mitigate their impacts on the SDGs while generating the resources and products that can help advance our shared goals. I'll stop there for the moment.
Lisa, thank you. A model of pith and concision, and for introducing, I think, the very important dimension of private investment and financial flows. Lisa, let me just pursue this briefly. There have been many observers who have said that the financial sector has become our master rather than our servant. That they have that the financial sector is effectively too involved in secondary markets focused on speculation than connected to the real economy and serving production, especially that part of the production which can really include large sectors of the population. Lisa, how do you react to that characterization of contemporary finance? And is it a bridgeable gap? Is there a way for us to recapture finance to be in the service of sustainable, inclusive production?
Yeah, great question. Overwhelmingly, alas, yes, I agree. I think there's no limit, honestly, to the financial sector and their pursuit of profits. And we see that infiltrating our work on judicial systems and other things as well. The financial sector just infiltrates, and it's driven by profit. And as I highlighted, there's absolutely a disconnect between the profits of the financial sector and the markets and what's happening on the ground. So absolutely a disconnect. I do believe that we can rein it in. I think the financial markets, I think that they will be reined in. And the question is when and how much will we have paid? How much will we have lost in the meantime? The crises are unavoidable. They're worsening. There's going to be a societal reckoning of this disconnect, of the mass inequality. And that's going to happen. I think that's the future. And the question is, what will we have lost in the meantime? I really believe it, Geraldine. I agree with Geraldine. To me, this is the role of the public sector. I think that regulation can play a very important role. I think public opinion is overwhelmingly pushing for that. We are trying to shape that. I think one step in that direction, and I'll end here, is highlighting that disconnect. For one aspect of it is highlighting, for instance, the disconnect between this growing field of quote unquote sustainable investment or ESG investing and actual SDG outcomes. There is nothing about ESG investing, environmental and social governance, integration and investment decisions that actually has any bearing on the impact on the SDGs. It is kind of a risk framework for the financial sector to maximize returns by accounting for more risks. That is not the same thing as aligning investment and investment flows with the SDGs. So I think highlighting these gaps, stepping up public mobilization to call on the financial sector to realign, stepping up the capacity and the drive of the public sector to regulate. I'm hopeful.
Thanks, Lisa. More to come on this, but a really important addition to the discussion so far. I'm going to turn now to Nasser Saidi, who's joining us from Dubai. Nasser, who is president of Nasser Saidi and Associates, a former minister of economy in Lebanon, and many other distinguished things. Nasser, come in here now. Tell us from where you sit how this issue should be attacked.
Just to correct, I'm actually talking to you from Beirut.
So, great! Thank you, Nasser.
I'm living at the center of a disaster which has hit my country, which is also host to just about 1.5 million refugees, mainly from Syria. So I think we'll come back to that because part of your question has to do with minorities and other vulnerable populations around the world. But let me just set the scene because I want to build a little bit on what Geraldine said and what Lisa said. But let's understand where we are to begin with. In terms of 2020, we're projecting a decline in world economic growth of about 4.5% in real terms. That is massive. We haven't had anything as much as that since the Second World War. But more important, I think, for our discussion is the fact that labor income is expected to decline by about 10%. So to Lisa's point, the rich are doing well, thank you very much. They continue to do well, they grow their fortunes. But it is labor income which has declined substantially. Trade declining, global trade declining by about 9%, very substantially. And along with tourism, and everything related to services on a global basis. And finally, and this is shocking, global FDI declining by some 50% in the first half of the year. Now, why are these all important? They're all important because they add to the growing inequality. And if you look at the various estimates that we have of inequality that we're concerned with, it looks like all the progress that was done since 2008 has now been reversed. It looks like it'll be reversed. So if you look at the degree of inequality, we're going back to what we had back before 12, 15 years. And I want to point to one thing, namely, it's mainly affected women, and I need to bring that into the discussion. It is women who have been the most vulnerable, and particularly as a result of COVID. So we've said there are 4 major forces at work right now. One of them is COVID, the other is climate change, the so-called fourth industrial revolution, and of course, the forces of inequality which are growing. But the major impact of that is on women for many reasons, and particularly because of COVID. They're in services which require a lot of personal contact, so in many social sectors. They're typically involved in the informal sector and the rural sector and agriculture. And whenever you're involved in the informal sector, you tend to get more adversely affected than in the formal sector because you don't have the social safety nets, you don't have things to fall back on. And then they tend to do much more unpaid work, as we know. And that has increased as a result of COVID. So they're back at home, they'd have to take care of the children, their parents, and others. And of course, as a result of all that, young girls, young women tend to drop off from the labor market and drop off from school. And that means that you're building up less human capital as time goes on. So I think what we're being faced as a result of COVID is two major things. One is that it's going to last much longer. We're talking now about scarring of economies. If I look at some of the numbers in terms of cumulative losses, we're talking about up to $28 trillion in lost output for the world as a whole from now to 2025. And of course, that might change with a vaccine, but even a vaccine will have to be distributed globally in order to have an impact. We're not going to see anything before late in 2021. And even then, it'll probably get distributed to the more advanced, richer countries of the world rather than the poor, lower income countries. So I'm much less hopeful than many people who think that, the vaccine is there and therefore we can relax. The answer is we cannot relax. So let me I think of some of the practical aspects that you asked about. What is it that we should be doing? I think there are three things that we should be doing. Number one, we need to be thinking about investment in public health systems. One thing that came out of the pandemic is that we did not take care of physical risks. It's not just climate risks, to which I'll come back to, but the pandemic has revealed a large number of gaps in terms of our public health systems, and particularly in lesser developed countries or emerging economies generally. So one thing that we need to focus on for future pandemics and any other types of physical risks is greater investment in public health systems. And that is across the board. But second, I think, is the issue of the digital divide, which is growing. One thing that's come out of COVID, of course, is that not everybody can work from home, not everybody can learn online. And in fact, the digital divide, which existed before COVID, is now becoming wider. The gap is growing. So one thing that we'll need to focus on will be how do we invest more into the digital economy? And in particular, how do we get broadband and access to the largest number of people? That is going to be the critical thing moving forward, because if you are left out in a digital world, you're going to be severely left out for the rest of your life. So focusing on digital investments, on broadband, making it reach the largest fraction of people possible is going to be critical moving forward. That means, for example, giving digital identities to many people. And so one example I will give of that, because I've lived it, is for refugees. I live in a region which now has 60% and more of the world's refugees. They're apart from the internally displaced as well. Many of them have lost their identity, literally, and they cannot go back home because their own country from which they try to escape will not recognize them any longer. So it is for the international bodies such as the UN to give them what I would call an e-identity, an e-passport. So that's something that I would like to table in terms of how we move forward. As soon as you give them an e-identity, that allows them to go online. They can then benefit from a lot of services, health services, educational services, and you can also pay them cash and make transfers to them. So this e-identity and e-passport, I think, is something that we need to work for. And as well, giving them access to broadband and the digital world. Third area has to do with investment in climate mitigation and renewable infrastructure, renewable energy, clean technology. I think that needs to be our top priority. As we move forward, I think climate change, as we all agree, is the single most threatening to the globe, to the world as a whole. And as Lisa was saying, it's not just to human animals, it's to the whole plant and animal kingdom as well. And what we need to do there is to start working on climate mitigating technologies and, of course, work on reducing and increasing the energy transition towards renewable energy. What that means, of course, is recognizing climate risks. And I think here I'm relatively hopeful in the following way, that there's now a greater realization that climate risks will affect all sectors of the economy, and in particular the banking and financial sector. And the reason why that becomes more interesting is that the banking and financial sector, starting with central banks, are now understanding now that climate risks are underpriced, that fossil fuel risks are underpriced. So they're going to start integrating climate risks into the pricing of any type of investment or loan. That, I think, is an excellent way forward, because what it will mean is that you're starting to recognize externalities coming out of financing fossil fuel, financing any activity which carbonizes our economy. So I'm hopeful that as you regulate that, and increasingly as you impose costs because of these externalities, you're going to get a shift towards more sustainable finance. And it goes beyond ESG, because I think we should no longer be talking about ESG. We should be talking about climate risk and how do we mitigate climate risks and what do we do about it. So continuing just
a few seconds and share your last thought on this.
Right. The last thing is that it is feasible to get financing. And I'm hopeful, for example, that green bonds and green sukuk are now growing very rapidly. We've seen that in 2020, 2019, and I think we should push again in that direction. What it would allow us to do is to get into PPP. And PPP, particularly for renewable energy, can be extremely important for developing countries, because the beautiful thing about renewable energy is that you no longer need national grids. You can distribute solar, you can have plants across anywhere, and therefore it moves you away from carbonizing your economy to having more local sources of energy, which allow then people to live their lives, have access to electricity, and enter into the digital economy without pollution. I'll rest there.
Thank you very much, Nasser. That's an ambitious and insightful agenda, investing in public health, investing in overcoming the digital divide, which we know has been always an issue, but COVID has revealed in very, very sharp relief. And thirdly, investing in climate technologies, renewable energy, including mobilizing the financial system to and directing it in those ways. Really a very important and I think ambitious agenda along the lines we've been talking about. So thank you very much, Nasser. I'd like to now turn to Carol-Ann Hilton for the next intervention. Carol-Ann, I didn't confirm where you're joining us from. Are you in Victoria?
Victoria.
And yeah, so joining us from Victoria, CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute in Victoria, a creative and insightful kind of think and do tank, I guess, Carol-Ann, thinking about important ways to reconceive our relationship to people, planet, and the economy. Carol-Ann, where do you sit on all this?
For sure. Thank you. Thank you for your leadership in bringing this conversation together today. So I'm not an economist, but I call myself an economic architect. I'm obsessed with economics. And I want to introduce you to the concept of indigenomics today. So indigenomics is a new word, and essentially it is economics from an indigenous worldview. I encourage you right now to take a look around you where you're located and your built environment, because the majority of this built environment has been built from one worldview. And that's exactly what we're needing to respond to today. This is the same for economy. This is the same for finance. When we understand these structures and the influence of how they've been built, what is being called today is the expansion of worldview. Indigenomics is essentially a response to 153 years here in Canada of systemic designed Indigenous economic exclusion. So when we build on this truth of a Canada that is deeply connected to the success of a future that is the alignment of Indigenous population and our economic success, my work here in Canada is essentially facilitating the structure of future-pacing Canada's economic reality. Essentially, that means establishing a national annual target of $100 billion Indigenous economy. So bringing into visibility that Canada was shaped through both colonization and the establishment of a country built from economic exclusion, Indigenomics is essentially the response. I believe very much the experience of marginalization, of how we experience that as an Indigenous population here in Canada, is actually an overrepresentation of one worldview. If we look at this concept of the socioeconomic gap, here in Canada, we're consistently referring to Indigenous peoples as falling behind. So falling behind of whether that's health indicators, poverty levels, death rates, people in jail, whatever those numbers are, that gap is really the myth that needs to be addressed. And what we need to address from is the architecture of economics itself. In the work that I do at the Institute, I have established a concept called the Indigenomics economic mix, which is 12 levers or enablers to support the modern constructive generative economic design of the growth of the Indigenous economy. Those include equity ownership, capital, entrepreneurship, trade, procurement, clean energy, technology, investment, to name some. Here in my work, I'm also establishing the concept of an Indigenomics Economic Freedom Index, asking the question, can we measure dependency? So instead of measuring poverty, instead of measuring, looking at that as a singular construct of the socioeconomic gap, what becomes important is to utilize metrics, money, and meaning to facilitate de-risking the perception of the investment into the Indigenous economy itself. The concept of Indigenous economic freedom supports building an ecosystem, a constellation that requires the expansion and inclusion of Indigenous worldview. As an economic architect, my focus right now is on building a global center of Indigenomics. This global center will house two core functions. The first is the establishment of a virtual Indigenous global marketplace that expands the concept of market, where market is not an externalized concept, but something designed and related directly to our humanity. To design an Indigenous marketplace based on this concept of the Indigenomics economic mix, those 12 enablers of Indigenous economic design. Indigenomics is essentially a response to colonialism, where in some areas we've experienced 500 plus years of colonialism itself. The concept of the global center will secondly establish a concept of an I-70, a collection of the Indigenous nations with high Indigenous populations, and look at activating the financial architecture of the experience of colonization itself. To bring into light and to bring into visibility the structure and impact of colonialism as a business model that is not only relevant, but being upheld today. To deconstruct colonialism as a business model and our experience of that is essentially the architectural question of our time. Our response to now must be human-centric. It cannot exist in fixing the markets. It cannot exist essentially devoid of humanity. The return to humanity, to the concept of market, is essential and an opportunity that I see that COVID itself has quickened the conversations, the meaning, and the metrics of what is most important to us today. In looking at this concept of expansion of worldview, what is important in that is that the disruption that is occurring in the depth and ways that we relate to each other. So utilizing technology, utilizing the space for innovation is really the opportunity that I have seen that no other generation has had like what we have right now. Thank you.
Caroline, wow, what a extraordinary vision you've painted. You know, a lot of economic thinking around inclusion. Basically, the basic recipe is to humanize the current market environment. Basically, let the market results fall where they may, tax the rich, and then use that money through the public sector to compensate all the losers. What you're saying, I think, is something quite different. We need to remake the market itself so that the distribution of results for the market itself have a different view. And I think you've got this list of 12 levers. Can you just take one of them and just spin it out? Let's take this idea of equity ownership. Carol, just spend kind of, a minute or so telling us about what equity ownership means in this system and why you think it would change something fundamental about how the market operates.
For sure. So looking at this concept of Indigenous worldview is inherent, comes embedded with this inherent concept of responsibility and stewardship over long-term generational transfer. So this concept of stewardship and responsibility is directly connected to the ESG goals. It's directly connected to economic performance itself. So when we utilize equity ownership, we're increasing Indigenous peoples at the table. What becomes important in that is that there is also space established at the economic table. And that space also facilitates leadership of inclusion of Indigenous perspectives around risk management in resource projects and reflected in the structure of ownership of large projects itself. We look at examples such as Bolivia, where we see this unfolding narrative around the risk of resources and the isolation of those resources from an Indigenous perspective. Now, utilizing this concept of the economic mix returns it relabels the economic structure of accessibility, innovation, and inclusion. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline, for laying that all out for us with such clarity and conviction, a really important part of this conversation. I'm going to now turn to our last speaker, my colleague, Elissar Sarrouh. Before I do that, I want to just preview what's going to happen after Elissar's remarks, which is it's time for us to have a bit of an exchange, to convert this conversation among the panelists to a conversation among all of us in this virtual roundtable. So the way it'll work is you should be able to raise your hand. If you don't know exactly how to do that, just send a little note to in the chat to Mike, who's our virtual stage manager. But you should be able to see in the participant list an opportunity for you to click on raise hands. I'm going to keep a running list here of people who are raising their hands, and I'm going to start asking you to put on your video so we can see you, so it's as if we're in one room, and start throwing it to some of you to offer your views with a real focus on recommendations and actions. What are the directions you think we should be moving in, and who should be moving in those directions? So that's to come right after we hear the insights from my colleague and co-champion for this roundtable, Elissar Sarrouh, who is the CEO of Expert Consulting on Governance. She's coming to us, like me, from Ottawa. Elissar, over to you. You're still on mute, Elissar. You're still on mute. There we go.
There we go. Thank you, Khalil. I'd like to start by thanking all the panelists for being with us today at the Victoria Forum, and also all the participants, and looking forward for a very rewarding discussions and productive way forward for us all. So listening to the four speakers. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, Elissar.
Okay, my computer froze for some reason.
But you're not frozen yet.
Okay, so you can hear me, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so listening to the four interventions before me, listening to Geraldine talking about the shift of the gravity center of thought to the east and the south. We start talking about is the investment, private sector investment enough to advance the SDGs and the global development agenda. To Nasser, who's raised the plight of women in holding the brunt of COVID, and the refugees who are now would be identified with identities. To Carol, who underlined the importance of indigenous economics. So that puts me to bring our discussion and raise three questions. And questions for what kind of the kind of crisis, the historic crisis we are living in today, more than any other time, requires that all the forces come together, all international organizations, governments, private sector, all actors of development come together. So that's the ideal situation where we can come together for a solution. But can you hear me? Because I see all frozen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, and we can see you too. All
right. So the first question then I wanted to raise to say, what is the reality on the ground if we need such a system to bring all these actors together so that we can put forward the policies and the programs that we need? I wanted to raise the issue of the political tensions that existed before COVID. And it was highlighted in a 2019 Global Risk Report, which warned us that the whole world is sleepwalking into crisis. And the global risks as they intensify, the global collective appears to be absent or lacking to come together to address those challenges. So then COVID hit, and we all experienced how we all struggled, and what started as a public health crisis, it became a governance crisis, it became a geopolitical crisis, and so on, and of course culminating with threat of global economic recession. So at this point, hearing all of that. So together in this forum, we're trying to bring forward some actual actionable policy options to move forward. And there's a lot of global processes right now that are underway to try to bring the different actors and propose different policy options. I mentioned one of them is the high-level meeting that took place in September that was convened by our Prime Minister of Canada and the Prime Minister of Jamaica and the Secretary General to bring together heads of states to put forward some solutions. So this discussions that we are having within this forum and others, hopefully we can stress the importance of international partnership. The second point I want to also to bring to the attention, also just before COVID hit, we were wondering, we were witnessing an emerging of a new development paradigm. And this was, such a discussion was taking place before the COVID, and report after reports from various sources, think tanks and international organizations were talking about that the old development paradigm is shifting, doesn't work anymore, and a new one was developing bringing in different actors, including non-OECD countries such as China, new emerging regional donors, philanthropists, social impact investors, and the private sector. But a key transformation in this emerging paradigm was a consensus by world leaders that the Agenda 2030 and the 17 goals can only be achieved with businesses and the private sector stepping up their engagement beyond corporate responsibility or charity funding. So what has emerged then is a paradigm shift that redefined the paradigm that financing the global development agenda as a strong business case and an investment opportunity, a shift that transforms the SDGs into an investment sector requiring new investment policies and regulations. And then the sustainability agenda has increasingly become central to a new wave of activist investors and shareholders that are demanding integrating environmental, social, and governance framework and alignment with the SDGs into corporate business strategies. So in post-COVID, this new emerging paradigm is taking shape and it's taking root, and it's becoming into a new investment development paradigm in full alignment with the private sector, financial institutions, development banks, and other financing instruments as the proposed paradigm to shape post-COVID resilient economies and inclusive recovery. But this raises a question on whether the investment business development paradigm will hold as the world is struggling to pull out from a serious pandemic and a global economic recession. The response to the coronavirus is also putting huge pressure on donor countries' public finances. And in recent years, we have seen that a combination of a lack of ambition to boost ODA, official development assistance budgets, and the belief that private actors will be able to fill the gap needed to meet the sustainable development goals has led to an increasing use of ODA to back the private sector. So this is a risky approach and brings into question whether, as also Lisa pointed, whether this heavily rooted in investment development paradigm it will be able to really address the challenges highlighted by our distinguished speakers. Is it going to be a priority to invest in public health sector? Is it a priority to invest in women empowerment or women investment, a new scheme of gender lens investing? Is it the priority to invest in small business enterprises in conflict countries? So these are fundamental questions that to say if we are really want to see a new, totally transformative paradigm to deliver resilient economies, is this paradigm really adequate and suitable for comprehensive for the kind of problems we are facing today? The last one, and quickly, I want you to mention. We are talking about resilient economies. We are talking about inclusive growth. We are talking about including diversity and inclusion and women empowerment, and focusing diversity on including ethnic diverse communities, different ethnic groups, etc. So this kind of inclusive development would require a particular governance system. And also in recent months and recent years, the global governance question was in question, whether it was really able to adopt to the new challenges, to the renewed geopolitical competitions that was going on, to a multilateral system that seems not able to adapt to new world and new challenges. And then in the midst of that, focus comes especially from corporate governance, including, diversity and inclusion and women on boards as in supply chains, and as investors and all that. So in order to really ensure that we do include, that inclusive paradigm, it needs to be rooted in democratic governance values and system. And it needs to be rooted in a rights-based approach to development. Otherwise, how we are going to make sure that all the recovery packages, the stimulus packages, the fiscal policies that are in place are really addressing on equal footing the needs of those vulnerable communities that are really bearing the brunt of the COVID crisis. So I will stop here and, put into question, how do we deal with these three, disruptive factors moving forward to ensure that our recommendations are practical and they can be actionable and transformative.
Elissar, thank you. Thank you for cataloging even grander challenges than we have encountered to date. The geopolitical instability and disruption and disorientation that we're currently confronting, the fragility of the embryonic investment development paradigm that was with us pre-COVID, that is now itself may have been even too little too late, and it now feels entirely inadequate to the issues in front of us, and global governance, which seems antiquated in the face of new realities. So lots there, Elissar. Thank you. So there you have it. Well, here's how I'd like to proceed. If modesty and bandwidth permit, I'd love you to all put on your videos so we feel like we're in one room, and this is the time for us to get some reactions from each of you. Please use the raise hand feature on your Zoom screens, and if you can't figure it out, don't do it virtually. Just kind of wave your hands at me, and I'll point to you. If you don't want me to say the name that is appearing on the screen that you have, then you should change that name. Otherwise, I'll call you with that name. And I'm going to start with Geraldine, who has already put up her hand and asked to weigh in, and I'm going to ask others around the table here to come in as well. Geraldine.
I just want to say, Khalil, wow, it was quite a rich discussion that's come up. But I wanted to pick up one or two particular issues. And the one issue I thought I should respond to in example is a point raised by Carol Ann, when she spoke about this model that they want to develop called, is it indigenomics, with the 12 principles. Now, in South Africa, and it's no secret that South Africa is a country where the legacy of exclusion is still prevalent. In order to deal with this issue of exclusion, we have the Constitution and there's been various other legislation, but there was one particular piece that I think you may want to look at as well. And it's called the Broad-Based Black Economic Empowerment Codes of Good Practice. And this was put in place to regulate and promote transformation across South African industries. Now, there is other legislation, and there's also, obviously our Constitution, as I referred to. The other legislation is individual industrial policies, and there we have a mining charter. We also have the King Report of Governance in South Africa and the Employment Equity Act. Now, the elements, particularly in the broad-based Black economic empowerment codes, include ownership, management control, which includes employment equity and is seen as a measure of workplace diversity, and then skills development, enterprise development, and lastly, socioeconomic development. And companies get points on this for this. The purpose of it was to try and effect change in the structure of the economy. It was an attempt to change the racial basis of the economy as well as the gender base. But it doesn't happen that easily. You have this legislation in place, you have the practices and the quotas that should be reached. And because there's a point system for it, the companies will go for where there's the highest number of points and where the real change should take place. And this comes to Lisa's point earlier. A lot of the change should really be systemic. You can't really tinker at the edges. And there's real difficulty around it. And it begs the question you've raised, Khalil. So what do we do? And I'm going to pause here because there's a lot raised by everyone else, including Nasser, that I would have liked to respond to. And this also talks about the issue of migration and what we've seen in recent times. But let me pause right now. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Geraldine, for mining the recent South African experience so well there, because it does have lessons, I think, for better and for worse for this issue in the world. I'm going to turn to Nasser, who wants to get in, and then because I'm not seeing a lot of hands raised, I'm warning you all. I'm going to start calling on you. I'm going to start cold calling on you all to spur a bit of exchange. So get ready to be cold called. Sabrine, thank you. Okay, Nasser, and then to Sabrine. Okay, Nasser.
All right, thank you. Look, we've been all over the place. I want to bring us back to a little bit of order. And the order I would like to suggest is the following: that there is one single overarching imperative, and that is climate risk. This goes beyond talking about resilient economies or even inclusiveness. This is existential. And because it is existential, I think what we need to put in front of us is decarbonization. And when we talk about decarbonization, it has implications for economic governance, which Elissar was starting to point to. What I mean by that is that climate economics should now be the centerpiece for economic governance. And that means monetary policy, fiscal policy, social policy, what we invest in and how we invest should be guided by the impact on climate and on decarbonization. And as soon as you do that, many of the SDGs start falling into place because you have now a more complete framework having to do with decarbonization and climate economics. Let me give a quick example, 2 examples. One is concerning taxation. You start taxing activities which carbonize the economy. On the monetary policy side and financial policy, you start pricing risk in all banking, lending, and financial activities insofar as they affect the climate and how they do so. So you look across the whole supply chain. So what I'm proposing is that this will be the unifying theme for a lot of our activities, a lot of our thinking, and a lot of our policies, because then it translates as well into social policy. Who is going to be most affected by climate change? And then it gets into Geraldine and a lot of our concern concerning the impact of climate on migration. Increasingly, you're going to get climate refugees because of water, because of temperature, and all the rest. So what I would like to propose is that this becomes our unifying theme in terms of what should guide policy and what should guide investment, whether it's public investment or private investment.
Thank you, Nasser, for bringing that focus. Over to you, Sabrine. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for such a fertile discussion. I feel that I will veer a little bit from what Nasser just said to bring it back to climate. One thing that came up for me a lot while I was listening, especially when Geraldine talked about audacity and trust, is also the trust of the public sector to receive the audacity of the private sector, if that makes sense. And I'm wondering if there's anything else beyond regulation that can affect the misalignment between the private sector and the SDGs that Lisa mentioned.
Great,
so how
thanks.
can we encourage that?
Sorry, go ahead, Sabrine. I cut you off. Just say that last part again because I didn't catch it.
No, I was just saying, so I guess my question is really beyond regulatory action, what can we do to firstly encourage the private sector to be moving in this direction, to not be misaligned, but also what can we do to let that private sector actually be received, if that makes sense? Because I think there's a distrust on both sides.
And Sabrina, I feel like maybe before I hand it over to some of the folks, maybe Lisa wants to start with this. Between maybe there's a hypothesis lurking behind that question. Can I turn the table on you if that question was posed to you? Do you a couple of ideas come to mind that you would love to see?
Now you're putting me on the spot. Well, I don't really know. I think it is really a question, but I think. Yeah, my instinct is that there's a little bit of a mistrust of the private sector, and the movement towards a kind of a human marketplace, as Carol Ann talked about, really involves a revisioning of everything, and how do we allow that to really flourish? I'm not entirely sure.
Lisa, do you want to come in and help us?
Yeah,
through,
I don't know. It's a great and tough,
the trust and mindset gap between the two sectors.
Yeah, no, it's a great and tough question. On the first side about how we push, I do firmly believe in regulation, but I do think that there are other levers to push the private sector. One thing that we're seeing very clearly right now are supply chain pressures that come from consumers and downstream industries. So just as an example, as one of many examples, the downstream auto industry and consumer technologies are increasingly mandating, if not putting pressure on, if not mandating from their suppliers that they, can ensure no child or forced labor in their supply chains or other criteria for more sustainable supply chains. That's happening, of course, in other sectors as well. I think that they're imperfect for sure. Existing certification schemes which aim to do the same are imperfect, but they do illustrate the power that downstream consumers have, including the consumer-facing products who do care, who face reputational risks and others. So I think that that's one way in which we are seeing improvement, and what we can do to support them is to, from a research perspective, I think that more information is needed to highlight supply chain risks, to standardize the type of reporting. For instance, of carbon emissions, we don't have a standardized accounting framework for how to account for carbon intensity of minerals, just as an example. So I think that there's more that we as a society can do to standardize and make reporting more robust so that downstream consumers, whether industry or individual consumers, can make more informed choices. I tend to think that those types of supply chain initiatives are iterative with the regulatory processes. So as societal expectations increase, it'll make it, we've seen examples in transparency, for instance, in which regulation followed, consumer initiatives. So that's it. And then the tiny thing I would say on trust is I think that that's I work in particular in extractive industries where these challenges are overwhelming and the trust gap is massive. But what I would say there is that I don't yet see the honesty of industry. They recognize the trust gap, but there still is not the honesty about managing their impacts and the effects of their operations. So that's a tough one, but I think that we will address the trust when the companies are trustworthy, and that's what we keep saying.
Well, thanks.
Can I come back to what Sabrina was raising?
Yeah, hold on, just one thought before I know Geraldine and Nasser both want to get in. Before I do that, I'm going to give one more chance to our participants, and I'm going to ask if Paul or Terry, Isabella Monroe, or Shefa have anything to want to share, an observation or a question or just a puzzle as they hear all this. Nothing from you, Paul? Anything from you?
Yeah, I will just sort of just thinking about the humanitarian aspect of it, having spent over 25 years in the automotive industry since Lisa alluded to that. And we spent a great deal of time talking about the need to deal with emissions in the course of development and the use of new technologies. I will say that I am concerned about this concern about trust. Trust in terms of intercooperation in order to achieve those efficiencies, even as organizations need to compete in order to have successful profit margins. I think that one of the things we need to encourage or insist upon and even incentivize from the government's perspective is getting the major automakers to cooperate with each other in order to achieve these sustainable development goals. And until we can get to that level of engagement in the interest of citizens, particularly those who happen to be in environments that are often polluted, I think trust will continue to be a major issue that we have to try to wrestle with. And I think it's possible for us to do that. But I would love to see what others have to say about those concerns, even in the context of talking about race as a major social issue.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'm going to hand it over to Geraldine and Nasser, and then even maybe one more round with Caroline and Elissar as kind of final comment before we wrap up. But before I do that, Terry, Isabella, Monroe, anything from you before we turn it back to the panel?
Thank you so much. I'm just observing and learning from everybody, and I'm grateful to be here today. So
brilliant. Thanks very much. All right. I know that Geraldine and Nasser wanted to come in. Why don't you consider this both a response as well as maybe a closing thought, and then also offer an opportunity to Caroline and Elissar and Lisa if there's anything else they want to say before we wrap up. Geraldine.
I thought I'd say gentlemen first and have Nasser go first, because I actually want to challenge him on one point he's raised.
Nasser, the gauntlet is being thrown. So after you, Nasser.
How can I refuse that invitation? Look, I'm an economist, and I'll show my bias as an economist. And I tend to believe in the powers of pricing. So when we think about labeling products according to how much they hurt our environment, at the end of the day, what we're saying is we're signaling to consumers as well as producers that some activities, some products carbonize our economy, carbonize our environment, and therefore they are not desired. So a long time ago, we talked about emissions, and we put in limits for emissions that raise the price for that. But pricing is critical. So I come back to the central point. When we talk about climate economics, we've got to price climate risk across the whole supply chain. And the second point, to come back to what Sabrine wanted to talk about, is bringing in the private sector. And the way you bring in the private sector is through public-private partnerships, because a lot of what we're discussing has a great deal of spillovers, which are not always accounted for by the market. And therefore, you need public-private partnerships to address decarbonization and to have greater investment in desirable activities. So I'll just stop there by saying that a lot of it has to do with pricing climate risk across all activities. And I think we need to start doing that. We're not doing it very effectively. The accounting profession is just starting. There's a couple of working groups now in the accounting profession on how do I account for climate risk? How do I integrate that into balance sheets and profit loss accounts? We're at the beginning of a big transformation. Once that starts, and once you get fiscal authorities, monetary authorities, regulators coming in and using those instruments, you can start changing things fairly rapidly.
Thanks, Nasser. Geraldine, over to you. We're in our last just few minutes now, so maybe just very, very briefly, and then I'm going to make sure we get a chance for the others to weigh in before we wrap.
Okay, so I'm going to go staccato. on climate risk, as we deal with the whole issue of decarbonization and a transition towards a green, towards decarbonization and all that, I do want to say that developing countries must not carry the burden of that transition. And hence, when it comes to this question, we should consider a just transition, and it must be financed by those who were responsible for the reality we find ourselves in. And that's both governments and the private sectors. So I want to state that. That's the one point. The second point, the whole issue of an increasing digital divide, it's not a theory, it's a reality. The university that I'm at, Nelson Mandela University, at the moment, 7 of the residences have been isolated because of incidents of COVID within. Many of those kids come from rural areas, and if they were back home, they would not have been able to access education and tuition. So whilst I spoke about the importance of higher education institutions, we should also recognize that with that is the need to ensure that everyone in this situation is equipped with whether it is data, broadband, and otherwise. A third point that I do want to make around this is, and just give me a minute because there's just a small point I have. There's also alternate solutions within Africa, which has a broader ICT blanket, which is not covered by broadband. So for example, and this is an example, it's micro, if you look at mobile banking, you look at M-Pesa, there has been accessible solutions for some communities where the fourth industrial revolution spreads according to communities and not necessarily according to advancements. It's a micro issue that I've just thrown out. And then the last point that I do want to make, which is also around the private sector, and I think to Sabrina's point, I don't think it's only about PPPs in the traditional sense, but it's also social compacting through what could be called tripartite alliances. And here we have, again, in South Africa, institute, let's call it a structure called NEDLAC, that brings together the public sector, private sector, organized labor and all, that actually meets around policies and implementation of plans. It's a model that I know we adapted from the Swedish model. It has not worked so well over the past 10 years, but they're trying to ignite it again. But I think the big issue, and I will conclude on this, that this moment requires us to look at things differently. And that's why, Nasser, I also think that as we look at what you see yourself lapsing back into in terms of probably monetary and fiscal policy, taxation and otherwise, is it adapting to what the current climate needs? Is it audacious enough for the change we need to see? Thank you.
Thanks, Geraldine, very much for bringing audacity back to the table as we conclude. So for final thoughts, Caroline has been having a little bit of internet difficulty. Caroline, can you hear us? Well, if you can, I'm going to give you a final chance, so get ready. But before I do that, maybe I'll ask Elissar and then Lisa for a final thought before we wrap up. Elissar? You're on mute.
Thank
Here
you.
we go. I just wanted to say that I do understand what Nasser is saying about the climate crisis, but I think, and also he lives in a conflict country and a conflict region. And, if we are start to prioritize which is worse? Where are the crises? We are in a collective crisis. This is an era of crisis, and we have to really hit first where it can make a difference. And I think, as this pandemic taught us, it is a public health crisis that triggered the shortcomings of all the systems that we have. So we start by really looking at the local communities and providing health, education, reskilling for all the workers that are losing their jobs or will lose their jobs to offset the unemployment, gender sensitive stimulus packages to ensure that women are at the center of development paradigms and policies, and also to really work with the private sector on alignment of the SDGs with the ESGs, as well as with the sustainable business strategy that looks at supply chains as rights-based workers, not just, an end results of the products that they produce.
Thanks very much, Elissar. Carol Ann, you're back.
Thank you. I like this concept of bridging the divide, and I return to this concept of what we are experiencing is stemming from a crisis of worldview. And when we realize that this building and responding from the structures of innovation, that's the creative space where those solutions will be driven from the climate perspective, from inclusion and the digital divide. And those are really the most pressing aspects in terms of how we're able to respond to right now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carol Ann. Carol Ann, one of the questions in the chat was whether you could put in a link to maybe your institute and especially those 12 levers, if they're anywhere on your website. If you could just put that in the chat to everybody, I think it'll be very welcome. Lisa, any last word before we wrap up?
I won't. Thank you so much. Excellent and rich discussion on the point about aligning business activities with the SDGs and thinking about implications for the investment community. That's exactly what we're working on at my center, at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. So would welcome hearing from many of you, or follow us so that we can engage on the development of those standards and mechanisms for enforcement.
Well, Lisa, why don't you put your URL in the chat as well. I have failed miserably at the central task of the moderator, which was to keep us on time, but we're only 3 minutes over, so I do think I can claim success at least bringing together a very, very rich group of people with insight and perspective and lots of interesting debate. This is, I want to reiterate, my initial comment, which is I do believe this is one of the most pressing issues of our time. And I think the variety of responses we've had to this suggests that what we really need now is probably not more talk, but a lot of experimentation. We need to do a lot of things. In fact, I would say maybe what this moment calls for is an unleashing of a very radical and prolific set of experiments all around the world that are trying in practice to bridge the various divides and to see if we can develop in practice ways in which to advance an inclusive and sustainable economy that really serves humanity rather than humanity being the servant of it. So thanks very much to you all for this rich discussion. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Victoria Forum. Please join me especially in thanking our extraordinary panelists, Geraldine, Nasser, Elissar, Carol Ann, Lisa, for joining us in this discussion. There's lots going on in the forum later today and tomorrow, so I hope you'll partake in some of that. And on behalf of Elissar, the co-organizer of this conversation, and myself, I thank all the participants for joining us. And good luck in all your journeys and work on this issue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.